On the morning of our anniversary, I stood in the elevator of a quiet brick building downtown, watching the floor numbers climb, and I pressed my thumb against the small brass key in my coat pocket, the way a frightened woman presses a rosary. I was 68 years old. I had buried my husband 4 months earlier. I had been laughed at, packed into 8 cardboard boxes, and left to ration my own blood pressure pills in a room that smelled of damp plaster. And yet that morning I wore a clean gray suit, my back was straight, and my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, because I knew that before noon, every person who had written me off as a useless old woman would learn exactly how wrong they had been. The doors opened on the 3rd floor. Marcus was waiting. "Happy anniversary, Beverly," he said gently and took my hands. "Are you ready?" I was. But to understand how a clean gray suit and a brass key came to mean everything I have, to go back 4 months, to the worst week of my life, to the Tuesday afternoon Stanley died alone. He collapsed in the lobby of the flagship hotel, the very first building he ever owned, surrounded by guests and bellhops, and the soft piano music he insisted on having from morning until night. His heart simply stopped. He was 70 years old and had built an empire of hotels and restaurants from 200 borrowed dollars and a stubbornness that frightened bankers. And in the end, that same heart that drove him for 45 years gave out on a marble floor while I was across the city arranging flowers he would have hated. The doctors told me later there had been a condition, a weakness diagnosed quietly the year before, something he never once mentioned to me. He had known for a long time, and he had said nothing, and only much later would I understand why a man who hid his own dying heart would also hide a fortune. The funeral was a performance. 200 people came, half of them business partners who had never seen Stanley make coffee at 5 in the morning or sit up all night when Dustin had a fever as a boy. The lilies were obscene. Stanley loathed cut flowers. He said they were money you watched die. But there they were in white drifts, and there too was our son Dustin, 40 years old, and already on his phone in the front pew, his voice a low, businesslike murmur as he coordinated something with the lawyers before the casket was even closed. Beside him sat his wife Chelsea, the brand director of the company Stanley had spent his life building, scrolling through her tablet with dry eyes, and I heard her use the phrase, "rebrand opportunity," twice before the service began. I sat 1 row back alone. 45 years married into that family, and on the day we buried its founder, no one thought to sit beside the founder's wife. I did not cry. I think I was too stunned to cry. I kept waiting for someone to turn around and take my hand, and no one did, and the piano played, and the lilies died slowly in the heat. I want to tell you that I felt anger that day, because anger is cleaner than what I actually felt, which was a kind of vast and quiet bewilderment. For 45 years I had been the center of a household, the woman who remembered every birthday, who knew which of Stanley's partners took sugar and which took none, who had once in another life run a 100-room hotel with the calm precision of a ship's captain. And now I sat behind my own son like a poor relation tolerated out of obligation, watching strangers grieve a man they had invoiced, and I could not for the life of me understand how I had become so small that no one even thought to look at me. I did not know yet that someone had thought of me. I did not know that the smallest object in that entire funeral, smaller than a single lily, was about to matter more than every flower in the room. The will was read 2 days later in the offices of Gerald Voss, the corporate attorney on a high floor of glass and chrome that Stanley never liked. The conference table was so polished I could see my own face in it, old and small and far away. Dustin sat at the head as though he already owned the room. Chelsea sat at his right phone face down, for once her expression composed into something that wanted to look like grief. I sat at the far end. Voss opened a leather folder, cleared his throat, and began to read in that flat lawyer's voice, built to make cruelty sound like procedure. I, Stanley Porter, being of sound mind, declare this my last will and testament. Each phrase fell on the table like a coin. To my son, Dustin Porter, I leave full operational control of Porter Hospitality Group, including the Office of Chief Executive, together with the principal residence and the Porter brand and all rights attached to it. Dustin exhaled slowly through his nose, a small private smile he could not quite suppress. I watched Chelsea's hand tighten on the edge of the table, the knuckles whitening, and I understood even then that something was wrong for her. Everything had gone to Dustin. To Dustin, the son, the blood. Not one line, not one share, not one square foot had been left directly to her. She had married into the empire expecting to inherit a piece of it, and her father-in-law, who had never trusted her, had quietly arranged that she would own nothing in her own name at all. Her face did not move, but her eyes did, flicking once toward me with an expression I could not yet name. Voss turned the page. To my wife, Beverly Porter. The room went very still. I could hear the air conditioning, my own pulse, the faint hum of the city far below. To my wife, Beverly. Voss read, I leave the brass key held in my private safe together with the card enclosed beside it, and I instruct that the card not be discarded under any circumstances. He stopped. He looked up. He looked very deliberately at the polished surface of the table rather than at me. Silence. And then my son laughed. It was a short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, and it bounced off the glass walls and came back doubled. Chelsea pressed 2 fingers to her lips, but her shoulders shook. A key, Dustin said, wiping at the corner of his eye. Dad had a sense of humor right to the end. 45 years, and he leaves Mom a key and a note card. There has to be a mistake. Voss kept his neutral expression, the one lawyers spend years perfecting. There is no mistake. The will was drafted 11 weeks ago and witnessed by 3 independent parties. Mr. Porter was examined by physicians who certified his competence. It is entirely valid. It's embarrassing, Chelsea said, finding her voice, and the warmth she used in front of cameras was entirely gone from it. She gets a key. We're trying to run a serious company, and the founder's widow walks out of here with a key on a ribbon. She said she as though I were not seated 11 feet away. Something inside me cracked then. Not loudly. It was the silent kind of crack that runs through old porcelain, the kind you cannot see but know will never mend. Is that everything? I asked, and my voice sounded as though it belonged to a stranger, thin and distant. Voss nodded and turned to the final page. There is one further provision. Mrs. Porter may remain in the principal residence for 30 days. After that period, she is to vacate the property. 30 days. 45 years of marriage reduced to a brass key and 30 days. Chelsea was already doing arithmetic. I could see it in her face. We can move that along, she murmured to Dustin. She doesn't need all that space. We'll find her something reasonable. Reasonable. The word made me want to laugh, the way you laugh at a funeral when the grief has nowhere left to go. Reasonable like the career I gave up. I had been one of the finest hotel managers in the state once before Stanley, before Dustin, before I folded myself smaller and smaller until I disappeared entirely into the role of the founder's wife. Reasonable like the 45 years I spent making his world run so smoothly, he forgot I had ever wanted a world of my own. Don't be dramatic, Mom, Dustin said, gathering his papers not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Dad made his decisions. He obviously had his reasons. Maybe you should ask yourself what those reasons were. The words went into me like a thin blade between the ribs. Voss slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a single brass key, old-fashioned, heavier than it looked, and a cream-colored card folded once. These were in Mr. Porter's private safe, he said. Per the instructions, they are yours. I took them. The key weighed almost nothing in my palm, and yet holding it, I felt as though I were carrying the entire failed weight of my life. My children left the office talking about restructuring and credit lines and the spring relaunch. Not one of them looked back at me. I sat alone at that long, shining table, turning the key over in my wrinkled hand, wondering how a whole life could be made to fit inside something so small. It was only that night alone in the enormous bed I had shared with Stanley for 45 years that I finally unfolded the card. I had expected nothing. A line of farewell, perhaps, or worse, the cruel little joke everyone in that office assumed it to be. Instead, in Stanley's hard, angular handwriting, the hand I would know anywhere on earth, were 11 words that made no sense at all. Where I first asked and you first said yes, 8:23. I read it 3 times. Where I first asked and you first said yes. My eyes blurred and cleared. And then, very slowly, the breath went out of me because I understood that the card was not nonsense, and it was not a joke. Stanley never wrote a word without a reason. The man planned 10 moves ahead even when he poured the coffee. He had not asked me to marry him in any grand place. He had done it in a cramped little Italian restaurant near the corner of a street most people had forgotten, with no ring in his pocket and no money in the bank, on a date I had carried in my chest for 45 years. He had not been telling me where he proposed. He had been telling me where to go. The key trembled against the card in my hand, and for the first time since the marble floor and the lilies and the laughter, I felt something other than shame move through me. The brass was cold. The message was warm. And somewhere out there in the dark city behind a door, I did not yet know my husband had left me something he had been hiding for longer than I could imagine, and he had trusted that I, and only I, would be the one to find it. I did not go to the restaurant the next morning the way I imagine a braver woman would have. I told myself I would, and then the 30 days began to collapse around me, and bravery turned out to be a luxury I could no longer afford. Chelsea arrived at the mansion 3 days after the will was read with a clipboard and 2 men in gray coveralls, and she supervised the packing of my life as though she were taking inventory of a hotel that had failed an audit. "It's just protocol, Beverly," she said, watching one of the men wrap my mother's china. "We need to make sure nothing leaves that belongs to the estate." Belongs to the estate, as though I were a thief in the house I had run for 45 years. She opened every box. She checked every bag. When she found a small silver frame holding a photograph of Stanley and me on the steps of our first hotel, young and laughing and broke, she turned it over, decided it had no resale value, and let me keep it. And somehow that small mercy was the most humiliating thing of all. They moved me into a 1-room apartment on the far side of the city, a building where the hallways smelled of other people's cooking, and the radiator knocked all night like something trying to get in. 45 years reduced to 8 cardboard boxes stacked in the middle of a room with water stains on the ceiling and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Dustin paid the first month's rent and arranged a small monthly allowance, $600 deposited with a note from Chelsea that read, "This should be more than enough for one person. We expect you to manage it responsibly." I want to be very clear about something because it matters more than I understood at the time. Stanley did not do this to me. Not 1 hour of what came next was his design. The hunger, the cold, the silence, the slow erasure of my dignity, all of it came from my own son and the woman he had married, from their convenience and their contempt, and I spent weeks blaming the wrong man for it. The second month, the allowance stopped. No note this time, no explanation. The deposit simply did not come. I called Dustin's office from the payphone on the corner because I could no longer keep a phone of my own, and his secretary answered with the smooth, professional warmth they teach in the kind of hotels Stanley built. "Mr. Porter is in meetings all day. May I take a message?" "I'm his mother," I said. "It's about the rent. The money stopped." "I'll let him know you called." He never called back. I tried Chelsea. Her phone rang 4 times and went to a voicemail recorded in the bright, frictionless voice she used for the cameras. I left a message. I left another. I left a third, and somewhere in the third I heard my own voice begin to break, and I hung up before I could shame myself further. The silence that came back was not an accident. Silence, I was learning, is a decision people make about you. So I did what frightened women do. I rationed. My blood pressure pills cost $80 a month, and I began cutting them in half, then taking them every other day, watching the bottle the way a sailor watches fresh water. I ate once a day, mostly day-old bread from the discount bakery, and when it was on sale, a wedge of cheese that I made last a week. I lost weight I did not have to lose. My clothes hung off me. When I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror in the cruel fluorescent light, I saw a stranger, a thin gray ghost of a woman, and I could no longer find in her face the person I had been at 25. That was the part that frightened me most, more than the hunger, more than the cold. I had been somebody once. Before Stanley, before Dustin, I had been one of the youngest hotel managers in the state, a woman who could read a balance sheet at a glance and calm a furious guest with 3 sentences and keep 100 rooms running like a Swiss watch. I had loved that work the way you love a language you are fluent in. And then I married a man with a dream bigger than both of us, and I folded that fluent, capable woman away to make room for his ambition, one small surrender at a time, until I could not remember the sound of my own professional voice. I told myself it was love. There had been a moment decades ago that I returned too often in that cold room. Stanley had been opening his second hotel, and the launch was falling apart, the staff untrained, the bookings a disaster, and I had walked in one afternoon and quietly fixed all of it in 3 days the way I used to, and the manager he had hired wept with relief and asked me where I had learned to run a house like that. Stanley had laughed and put his arm around me and said, "She used to do this for a living, before she had better things to do." Before she had better things to do. He meant it kindly. He always meant it kindly. But I had stood there in the lobby I had just saved and felt myself disappear a little more, and I had said nothing, and that was the trouble with me. I had always said nothing. Perhaps it was love. But love that costs you your entire self is a strange and expensive thing. And sitting in that cold room, I finally let myself wonder whether I had given away too much. Every night before I tried to sleep on the thin mattress that came with the rental, I took out the card. Where I first asked, and you first said yes, 823. I knew what it meant. I knew the place, a cramped Italian restaurant on a forgotten corner where Stanley had proposed to me with no ring and no money, and a face so terrified I had said yes mostly to stop him trembling. I knew the date, the 23rd of August, the day I carried in my chest for 45 years. I understood the message perfectly. What I did not have in those first weeks was the strength to act on it. People imagine that despair is dramatic. It is not. Despair is small and gray and practical. It is the slow conviction that nothing you do will change anything, so why spend the bus fare? Why climb the stairs? Why hope? I would hold the card and think, what is the point? It is probably a sentiment, a goodbye, a man's last romantic gesture, pointing at a restaurant that closed years ago. The truth is that it was not Stanley's puzzle that kept me from the answer. It was the version of me that my children had made the version that had stopped believing she was worth a secret. I sold things to stay alive. First the clothes that no longer fit, then my books, then the small jewelry that had no story attached. A thrift shop 2 streets over gave me a few dollars a load, never enough, always almost enough to make the trip worthwhile, and I walked home each time a little emptier. The landlord, a heavy-set man whose breath always carried beer, began knocking on my door. "Mrs. Porter, you're 2 months behind." "I know. My son promised to pay." "I don't care about your son. I need the money or you're out. 2 weeks. He shut the door, and the ultimatum hung in the air of that little room like a sentence handed down. 2 weeks. $1,800 I did not have, and no way on earth to find it. That was the night I broke all the way down, and it was though I could not have known it the night everything turned. I sat on the floor with my back against the door because the mattress had begun to feel like a coffin, and I held the photograph of Stanley and me on the steps of our first hotel, and I held the card and I spoke out loud to a dead man in an empty room. "I can't do this anymore," I said. "I'm not strong, Stanley. I don't know why you thought I was. I'm sitting on a floor, and I'm hungry, and our son won't take my calls, and you left me a note card." And then because grief makes you say everything, I read the card aloud one more time, the way you reread a thing you have given up on. "Where I first asked, and you first said yes, 8:23. And I really looked at the photograph in my other hand. The steps of our first hotel. The first building Stanley ever owned in the old neighborhood, the same forgotten quarter where that little Italian restaurant had stood 2 doors down from a bank so old it still had a stone facade and a vault from another century. Stanley used to joke that he kept his whole future in that neighborhood, the restaurant where he proposed the hotel, where he started the bank, where he opened his first account with the $200 he had borrowed. And all at once the card stopped being a sentiment. It became an instruction. He had not been telling me where he loved me. He had been telling me where to go. The brass key was not a keepsake. A key like that, heavy old-fashioned, with a long shaft and a stamped number worn nearly smooth, was not a house key or a car key. It was the kind of key a bank gives you for a safe deposit box. And 8:23 was not only the day he proposed, it was a code. My hands shook so badly I dropped the card. For the first time in 2 months, I was not thinking about hunger or rent or the cruelty of my children. I was thinking like the woman I used to be, the one who read a situation in a single glance. And that woman was suddenly fiercely awake. I barely slept. At 9 the next morning, when the bank opened, I was standing outside its stone facade in my best coat with the key in my pocket and the photograph in my purse because I needed to bring him with me. Inside, the air was cool and hushed and smelled of old paper and money. A young clerk in a gray suit looked up. "I'd like to access a safe deposit box," I said, and to my own astonishment, my voice did not shake. "I'm not entirely sure of the box number, but I believe it's held under a family trust. The name is Porter." She typed. She frowned at her screen, typed again, and her expression changed the way a person's face changes when the computer tells them the small old woman in front of them is more than she appears. "I have it," she said quietly. "The box is registered to the Porter Family Trust. Are you Beverly Porter?" "I am." "May I see your identification?" I gave her my driver's license with a hand I willed to be steady. She studied it, studied me, and something in her manner shifted into a careful respect I had not been shown in months. "You're listed as an authorized signatory on the trust," she said. "You have full access. The box doesn't require a court order or probate, ma'am. It's held by the trust directly. I just need the access code on file." She slid a small keypad across the counter. My whole life narrowed to 10 little numbers. I keyed in 823 and then, because a date is only 6 numbers and a code is usually more, I added the year we married the way Stanley would have, the way that joined the day he asked to the woman who said yes. The screen held its breath, then a small green light. The clerk smiled. "This way, Mrs. Porter." She led me through a heavy gate into a quiet room lined floor to ceiling with steel doors, and together we turned 2 keys in a single lock, hers and mine, and she drew out a long, flat metal box and set it on the table and left me alone with it and pulled a curtain for privacy. For a long moment, I could not open it. I sat with my hands flat on the cold lid, my heart going like a drum, certain and terrified at once. Then I lifted it. Inside there was no money, no jewels, no bundles of cash, nothing I had braced myself to find or to be disappointed by. There was a thick folder of documents, crisp and official, bound with a clip, and on the very top page, in heavy legal type beneath a notary's seal, were words that stopped my breath entirely. Declaration of Trust. The Porter Family Trust. Sole lifetime beneficiary Beverly Porter. I turned the page with a trembling hand, and then the next, and the room seemed to tilt around me. These were not sentiments. These were deeds. Title documents. Holdings. Page after page of property and assets I had never heard of, all of them placed years ago into a trust that named me and me alone as the person they were built to protect. And tucked into the front of the folder in Stanley's hard, angular hand was a single folded note. Beverly, if you are reading this, you found your way, which means you are already stronger than they made you believe. There is far more here than you can take in today, and far more still that I have not yet shown you. Call the number on the inside of this folder. Tell no one. Everything will be made whole on our anniversary. I am sorry it had to begin in the dark. It does not end there. Yours always. I sat alone in that vault, a woman who had been rationing pills and selling her books, holding in my two thin hands the first proof that the man everyone said had forgotten me had in fact in silence and secret for years been the only person on earth who never did. I waited until I was home to make the call, though home is a generous word for that room. I needed walls around me, even ugly ones, before I dialed the number printed on the inside of the folder, a number with no name beside it. My hand hovered over the buttons of the payphone for a long time. Whoever answered would know something about my husband that I did not, and after the vault, I was no longer sure how much truth I could carry in a single day. I dialed. It rang 3 times 4, and on the 5th a man's voice answered, older than mine, warm and unhurried, as though he had been sitting beside the phone for a long while. "Hello, Beverly," he said. "I have been waiting for your call." My throat closed. He knew my name. He had been expecting me. "Who is this?" I managed. "My name is Marcus Bellini. I was your husband's friend for 40 years and his private attorney separate from Gerald Voss and everything that man handles for the company. Stanley asked me to wait for you. He told me your call would come exactly when you needed it to and not a day before." I sat down on the floor because my legs would not hold me. "I don't understand any of this," I said. "I know, and I am more sorry than I can say for what you have been through these last weeks. I have known the whole of it, and being made to stand back while it happened was the hardest thing your husband ever asked of me." That stopped me. "You knew. You knew I was hungry, that they cut me off, that I was selling my books, and you did nothing." There was a long breath on the line. "I knew, and it was unbearable, and Stanley made me swear an oath I have regretted every day since he died. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that if I stepped in too soon, you would never reach the box on your own, and that reaching it on your own was the one thing that might wake you. He was wrong about the cruelty of it. He admitted as much to me at the end. But he was not wrong about you. You found your way, Beverly. Now let me do what I have been waiting to do." I should have been angry. Part of me was. But mostly I was simply too tired and too astonished to be anything but quiet. So I asked the only question that mattered. "What is in that folder, Mr. Bellini? What did Stanley do?" "Call me Marcus," he said. "And I will tell you, but you should sit down, because what you found today is only the smaller half of it." I told him I was already on the floor. He laughed softly, kindly, and then he began. 15 years ago, he said, your husband came to me with an idea that frightened me. He had built Porter Hospitality into something enormous, hotels and restaurants across the West, and on paper he was worth a great deal of money. But Stanley had begun to watch his family, and he did not like what he saw growing in them. He watched Dustin become a man who confused inheritance with achievement. He watched Chelsea marry into the family and begin to treat the company and you as obstacles between her and the life she felt she was owed. And he made a decision. He decided that the visible empire, the one with his name in lights, would go to the children because that is what they expected and what they would tear the family apart to get. But the foundation beneath it, the real and lasting value, he would quietly move somewhere safe. He would move it to you. I pressed the photograph of the two of us against my chest. Move what exactly? Over the years, Marcus said, Stanley placed a series of assets into the Porter Family Trust, the trust you now control as lifetime beneficiary. Real estate holdings and a separate investment company that has nothing to do with the hotels and carries no debt of any kind. The documents in your box are the deeds and the declaration. There is also cash accumulated rents and returns that have been flowing into the trust's accounts for years. Beverly, I need you to hear this clearly, because you have spent 2 months believing you had nothing. The trust holds well over $100 million in value, and it is entirely yours, and it is entirely clean. I did not speak. I could not. The radiator knocked in the wall, and somewhere above me a baby cried, and $100 million sat in my lap in the form of a folder I had nearly left in a vault, because I was too defeated to read it. That isn't possible, I finally said. He would have told me. In 45 years, he told me everything. He told you everything except the one thing you could not be trusted with, Marcus said gently, which was your own security. Beverly, think honestly. If Stanley had come to you while he was alive and said, I have set aside a fortune that belongs to you, and you alone, what would you have done with it? I knew the answer before he finished the question, and the knowing of it broke something open in me. I would have given it to the children, I whispered. I would have insisted. For Dustin's business, for a grandchild, for anyone but myself. Of course you would have. You have spent your whole life putting yourself last. Stanley knew that better than anyone because he had let you do it, and he carried the guilt of it to the end. So he built you a wall you could not give away. He did not hide this from you to punish you. He hid it to protect you from your own generosity and from them. I wept then quietly the way you weep when anger and grief and relief all arrive at once and cancel each other into something that is none of them. Why did he have a weak heart and never tell me, I asked, because it was all connected now, the secrecy of the money and the secrecy of his dying. Because they are the same secret, Marcus said. He was diagnosed the year before he passed. A serious condition, the kind that can take a man at any moment. He did not tell you because he did not want to spend his last year being nursed and pitied, and he did not tell you because the diagnosis is what set all of this in motion. The day he learned how little time he might have, he came to my office and we finished the trust, the letter in your box, the instructions, all of it. He was not playing a game with you, Beverly. He was a dying man building a shelter for his wife as fast as his failing heart would let him. The heart attack still came suddenly sooner than the doctors guessed. But he had already finished the wall. That is the only reason any of this exists. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from being loved more than you knew too late to thank the person for it, and it is heavier than ordinary sorrow. I sat with it on the floor of that miserable room until my tears ran out. Then Marcus said the practical thing that pulled me back to the surface. Now, there is a man threatening to put you on the street in 2 weeks. That ends today. I am the trustee of the Porter Family Trust, which means I have the legal authority to make distributions to you, its beneficiary, whenever I judge it necessary, and I judge it very necessary now. I am wiring funds to an account I am opening in your name this afternoon. Pay the rent, pay it forward, eat 3 proper meals. See a doctor about those pills you have been cutting in half because I know you have been. This is not charity. and it is not alone. It is your own money finally reaching you." I had no words, so I said the only true one. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," he said. There was something I had to ask because the old careful part of my mind had woken up in the vault and would not go quiet. "If the money is mine now, and you can send it now, then why does Stanley's letter say everything will be made whole on our anniversary? Why must I wait at all?" "A fair question, and the answer is simpler than you fear," Marcus said. "The trust holds the assets already today, this minute. You are safe today." But Stanley wrote a formal vesting date into the documents the day the full transfer is recorded and made public and irreversible. And he chose your anniversary for it, both because it mattered to him and because it gives the lawyers the time they need to file everything cleanly. Until that date arrives, I will keep you fed, housed, and cared for, because I have the authority to do exactly that as trustee. So understand me, Beverly. The waiting is no longer the waiting you have known. You will not be hungry again. You will not be cold again. The hard part is over. What remains is paperwork and one appointed morning when the truth steps into the light. There is one more thing you need to understand today, and it is the thing Stanley was most proud of, and I think it will tell you exactly the kind of man you were married to. I waited. When your husband split the empire, Marcus said, he did not simply divide it into a good half and a bad half and hand you the good one. He was far more clever than that. He separated the company into two pieces that depend on each other. Dustin inherited the operating company Porter Hospitality, the brand, the staff, the bookings, the daily business of running hotels and restaurants. That is what carries the debt, the expansion loans, the leases, all of it. But the operating company does not own the buildings it runs. It does not own the land beneath them. A cold, clarifying understanding began to move up my spine. "The trust does," Marcus said. "The trust holds the property company, the land under the flagship hotel, the ground beneath every Porter property he placed in it, the very dirt those buildings stand on. The children know perfectly well that the company leases its locations. Every hospitality group on earth does. It is ordinary. It is invisible. They have never given it a second thought. What they do not know, what no one knows, because the trust holds it through a quiet intermediary company with a name on it that means nothing to them, is who the landlord is." I understood then fully, and the understanding was so large I had to say it out loud to believe it. "I'm the landlord," I said. "I own the ground under my son's hotels." "You own the ground under all of it," Marcus said quietly. "Dustin sits in the founder's chair and signs the lease checks every month. He has no idea they are signed to his mother. Stanley built it that way on purpose, Beverly. He gave the children the chair, and he gave you the floor it stands on. And on your anniversary, in front of every one of them, the world is going to learn whose floor it always was." The money reached me that same afternoon, and with it something I had not felt in 2 months, the ground holding steady under my feet. I paid the landlord in full the next morning 2 months behind, and 1 month ahead, counting the bills onto his cluttered desk, while he watched me with a suspicion that slowly curdled into something almost like fear. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "That is not your concern," I said, and walked out with my back straight and did not look back. I did not move out of that room, not yet. Marcus had urged me to find somewhere decent, but I had grown strangely attached to the ugly little apartment, the way you grow attached to a foxhole that kept you alive. Instead, I let myself heal there quietly on my own terms. I ate 3 meals a day. I saw a doctor who frowned at my blood pressure and put me back on a full dose, and asked kindly whether I had been under stress, and I nearly laughed. I bought a few new things, nothing extravagant, 2 simple dresses and a good gray suit and a pair of shoes that did not pinch. And slowly in the mirror the gray ghost began to recede. and underneath her I started to see a face I half remembered the face of a woman who had once run 100 rooms without raising her voice. I told no one. That was the hardest discipline and the most satisfying. I went on living like a poor, abandoned widow riding the bus, shopping the discount aisles out of habit more than need, and I let the city look at me and see exactly what it expected to see an old woman of no importance, while inside me a secret burned like a banked coal. People treat you as furniture when they decide you are powerless, and I learned in those weeks that there is a curious freedom in being underestimated. You hear everything. You are forgotten in the corner of every room. And I was content to wait in that corner because Stanley had taught me even in death that the patient hand wins. 3 weeks before our anniversary, the call came that I had been half expecting. It was Gerald Voss, the corporate attorney, and his smooth voice had a thread of tension running through it that he could not quite iron flat. "Mrs. Porter," he said, "I need you to come to my office. It concerns your late husband's estate. It is rather urgent." "About what?" I asked, keeping my own voice mild, almost vague, the voice of a confused old woman. "I would prefer to discuss it in person. Tomorrow at 2, if you are able." I said I was able. I dressed carefully the next day, the gray suit, the good shoes, my hair done for the first time in months. And when I walked into that glass and chrome office, the same receptionist who had once looked through me now looked at me twice, uncertain, recalculating. Voss had me shown straight in, and he was not alone. Dustin was there, and Chelsea beside him, both of them seated in the same chairs they had occupied on the day they laughed at me. But there was no laughter in the room now. Dustin looked gray and hollowed out a man who had not been sleeping. Chelsea's perfect composure had cracks running through it, the foundation of her makeup a shade too heavy as if applied over a face that had been crying. They looked at me as I came in, and something flickered across both their faces that I had not seen directed at me in years. Worry, perhaps even fear. "Sit down, Mom," Dustin said and gestured to the chair at the foot of the table, the same far chair, and I sat, and I folded my hands, and I waited. Voss cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, and spoke in the careful tone lawyers use to make catastrophe sound procedural. "Mrs. Porter, over the past several weeks, as part of the transition of control, we have been conducting a full audit of Porter Hospitality Group, and I am afraid we have uncovered a serious financial situation." "What sort of situation?" I asked. Dustin answered before Voss could, and his voice was raw. "Debt. Enormous debt. Dad took on expansion loans over the last few years, new properties, renovations, all of it leveraged. On paper, the day he died, the company looked strong. The cash flow was there, the bookings were there. But the loans had terms, mom balloon payments, and covenants tied to Dad personally, to his name, to his guarantees. And the moment he died, the banks got nervous. They pulled the credit lines. They called in what they could. The whole thing was built to stand as long as he was standing, and the second he wasn't, it started to come down." I let the silence stretch. I had known this was coming. Marcus had told me the shape of it, but hearing it from my son's own mouth was a different thing, and I confess a small dark part of me felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow. "How bad is it?" I asked. "We are technically insolvent," Voss said quietly. "The group's liabilities now exceed the value of its operating assets. What makes it worse is the structure itself. The company owns very little outright. It leases nearly all of its locations, the buildings, the land, all of it, and those leases are fixed obligations that do not care whether the hotels are full or empty. We must pay the rent every month regardless. We had assumed, frankly, that the leases were a formality, an internal arrangement Mr. Porter had set up with himself. We have since learned they are held by an outside property company, and that company is owed a great deal of money, and it is not inclined to be charitable. Without a significant injection of capital, Porter hospitality will not survive the quarter." "40 million," Chelsea said suddenly, her voice brittle and too high. "We thought we inherited an empire, and it turns out we inherited $40 million of debt with a famous name painted on the side." I looked at her, and I let myself ask the question I already knew the answer to. "And the relaunch, the rebrand I kept hearing about the campaigns." Her jaw tightened. She did not answer, but Dustin did, too tired now to protect her. "We spent. Chelsea wanted to reposition the brand, make it younger, more luxury, more visible. New everything. We put millions into it before we understood what was underneath. We poured money onto a fire because we thought it was a fountain. So there it was laid out on the polished table, the son who confused a chair with an achievement, and the woman beside him who had set a sinking ship on fire to make it shine. I thought of all the nights I had cut my pills in half while these two redecorated a doomed brand, and I kept my face perfectly still. "I am very sorry to hear it," I said, and the strange thing is that I meant it. I was sorry. Not for them exactly, but for the whole sad shape of it, for the family Stanley and I had failed to raise into anything sturdier than this. "But I do not understand why you have called me here. I received a key and a note card. You told me yourselves that was all." Voss and the children exchanged a glance, and in that glance I saw the real reason for the meeting bloom into the open. "Mrs. Porter," Voss said delicately, "in cases like this, we are obligated to examine the full estate for any assets that might have been overlooked. Any accounts, any holdings, anything in your name that could be brought to bear to stabilize the company." There it was. After 2 months of silence, of cut allowances and unanswered calls, they had remembered I existed the moment they thought I might be useful. "You think I have money," I said. "We think Dad might have left something we missed," Dustin said, and he had the grace at least to look ashamed as he said it. "Something in your name, a safety net. He thought 10 moves ahead, Mom, you know he did. We were hoping maybe the phone, the key, whatever it opened, maybe there was something." And then he did something that surprised me. He glanced sideways at Chelsea, and then he looked back at me. And for just a moment the executive mask slipped, and I saw my boy underneath it, the one I used to rock through fevers, and he said low, almost to himself, "I'm sorry, Mom, for the apartment, for not calling you back. I told myself I was busy. That isn't true. I just didn't want to look at it." Chelsea's head turned toward him sharply, a warning, and the mask came back down over his face like a shutter. But I had seen it. I filed it away, that one honest flicker, and I did not know yet that it would matter only that it was the first true thing either of them had said to me in months. My heart was beating hard, but my hands were steady. This was the moment. I could have ended it right there. I could have laid the trust on the table and watched their faces collapse, and a younger, angrier version of me might have done exactly that. But I had waited 2 months and 3 weeks, and Stanley's whole design hinged on one appointed morning, and I found that I wanted more than I wanted the cheap pleasure of the reveal, to see exactly how far they would go, to know what was truly in them when they believed they were speaking to a powerless old woman who held their last hope. "The key," I said slowly, as if remembering, opened a safe deposit box at an old bank downtown. All 3 of them leaned forward at once, and I watched the hunger flood into their eyes, the same hunger I had seen flicker on Dustin's face when he was a boy who found coins in the sofa, except these were not coins. "And," Chelsea breathed. "What was in it?" I looked at her for a long moment. I let her wait. "Old photographs," I said. "Letters your father wrote me when we were young. A few keepsakes from when we had nothing. Things of no value to anyone but me." The disappointment that crossed their faces was so total, so undisguised, that it told me everything I would ever need to know about my son and the woman he had married. Chelsea actually slumped back in her chair. Dustin shut his eyes. Voss began quietly to gather his papers, the gesture of a man who has watched a last hope evaporate. And I sat at the foot of that long table, the landlord of every building. These people were about to lose the wealthiest person in the room by a margin none of them could imagine. And I folded my hands a little tighter and felt for the first time in 45 years the full and terrible calm of holding all the power and choosing for now to say nothing at all. The 3 weeks passed more quickly than I expected because for the first time in a long while I was not counting them in hunger. I ate well. I slept through the night. I walked in the mornings and felt my strength come back into my legs a little at a time, and I let myself very cautiously begin to imagine a future, though I did not yet dare to give it a shape. Marcus called twice in that time, brief practical calls. The filings are proceeding. The bank account is settled. See you on the appointed morning. And then the appointed morning came, the 23rd of August, our anniversary, the day Stanley had built his whole quiet machine to deliver. Which is where this story began, with me in the elevator of a brick building downtown, a brass key in my pocket, and a clean gray suit on my back, and my heart going like a drum. Marcus was waiting on the 3rd floor, a tall man in his 70s with white hair and gold-rimmed glasses and a warmth in his face that I had heard for weeks, but was only now seeing. "Happy anniversary, Beverly," he said, and took both my hands. "Are you ready?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Are they here?" "They are in the conference room, Dustin Chelsea and Gerald Voss. They believe they have been called to discuss outstanding matters of the estate. They have no idea what is coming." He paused, and his grip on my hands tightened gently. "Before we go in, there is one last thing Stanley left for you. He was very specific that you read it alone today before anything else." He led me into his office, an old room full of books and worn leather, nothing like the glass and chrome of Voss. And from his desk he took a thick envelope sealed with red wax. An old-fashioned touch, the kind of thing Stanley loved. "I'll leave you with it," Marcus said, and stepped out and closed the door. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside were several pages in Stanley's hard, angular hand, the handwriting I would know anywhere in the world, and I sat down in one of the old leather chairs and began to read. "My dearest Beverly, if you are reading this, then you survived, and I knew you would, though I want you to know how many nights I lay awake terrified that you would not, that the cruelty of how this had to begin would break the very person I built it all to save. I owe you the truth now, the whole of it, because you have earned it 100 times over. I need you to understand one thing above all others, and I need you to believe it even through your anger. I never wanted you to suffer. Not for an hour, not for a single meal. The months you spent cold and hungry and forgotten were never part of any plan of mine. That is the thing I cannot forgive myself for even now, even from wherever I am writing this to you." I had to stop and press the back of my hand to my mouth. Then I read on. "Here is what was supposed to happen. When I knew my heart was failing, I built the trust to protect you. And I wrote out clear instructions, and I told Marcus to come to you within days of my passing, to make certain you were cared for, and to guide you gently toward the box when you were ready. I did not want you to wander in the dark. I wanted Marcus at your side from the start. But I made one terrible miscalculation, Beverly, and it was about the children. I knew they were greedy. I did not know they were cruel. When I died, Dustin and Chelsea moved faster and harder than I ever imagined they would. They cut you off from the house, from money from me. They changed the locks on my office before Marcus could reach my instructions there. They intercepted his calls to you, screened them away as the calls of a stranger. And when he tried to come to you directly, they turned him from the door of the apartment they had hidden you in, because as far as they were concerned, he was nobody, an old friend with no standing. And you, my love, were so deep in grief, and so convinced of your own worthlessness, the worthlessness they spent years teaching you, that you nearly did not open the one door I left you. The suffering was not my design. It was their doing, and my failure to imagine how far they would go. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I built a shelter, and I did not foresee that they would lock you out of it for 2 months before you found the only key I could leave where they could not take it. The tears were falling onto the page, now smudging the ink, but they were not the tears I had wept on the floor of that apartment. These were something else entirely. And so I must ask why I built it this way at all. Why secrecy? Why a key and a card and a trust hidden behind a paper company? The answer is the hardest truth in this letter, and it is about you, and it is about me. I hid your fortune from you because if I had placed it in your open hands, you would have given it away. You would have poured it into Dustin's business, into Chelsea's ambitions, into anyone's need but your own, until there was nothing left, and you would have called that love. For 45 years I watched you disappear one sacrifice at a time, and I let you because it was easier for me because your disappearing made my life smooth. That was my sin, Beverly, not theirs. I am the one who taught them that you were furniture by treating your endless giving as the natural order of things. So I built you a wall you could not give away. I made it so that the only way you could receive this gift was to survive long enough and look hard enough to find the woman who used to read a balance sheet at a glance and run 100 rooms without raising her voice. She was always in there. I needed her to come back because she is the one who can hold a fortune without surrendering it, and you, my generous vanished wife, could not. Today, in front of our son and the woman he married, Marcus, is going to reveal all of it. They will see that the man they think forgot his wife, in fact left her everything that mattered. And then, my love, you will have a choice to make the first truly free choice of your life, and I will not be there to influence it. And that is exactly as it should be. Spend it on yourself. Build the thing you set aside for me. Live, Beverly, and do it loudly, and do not waste one more day being anybody's shadow. Happy anniversary. May this be the first of many that are finally completely your own. Yours always, Stanley. I sat for a long while with the pages in my lap, and I let myself grieve him properly for the first time, not as the man who had abandoned me, but as the man who had loved me so much and so clumsily that he could only protect me by breaking my heart first. When the tears stopped, I wiped my face and I straightened my back, and I stood. Marcus was waiting in the hall. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I am ready." We walked together to the conference room. Through the glass, I could see them already seated, Dustin and Chelsea on one side, Voss at the end, all three wearing the particular tightness of people who have been summoned and do not know why. When I came in, their heads turned, and I watched the confusion ripple across their faces, because the woman walking through that door was not the gray ghost they had pushed into an apartment. She was upright and clear-eyed and dressed with quiet dignity, and she did not sit at the foot of the table this time. She sat directly across from them, and Marcus took the head of the table and opened his briefcase. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you all for coming. My name is Marcus Bellini. I was Stanley Porter's closest friend for 40 years and the private attorney for a portion of his estate that Mr. Voss has never administered because he was never meant to. Today, on Mrs. Porter's anniversary, in accordance with Stanley's written instructions, the full truth of his estate becomes a matter of record." Dustin leaned forward. "What truth, what estate? We've been through the will." "You have been through one will," Marcus said, "which governed the operating company, the part of your father's wealth he intended you to have and to learn from." He drew out the first document and laid it on the table. 15 years ago, Stanley Porter established the Porter Family Trust with his wife Beverly as its sole lifetime beneficiary. Into that trust over many years he placed the following. He laid down the pages one at a time, and his voice was calm and level and merciless in its calm. A private investment company carrying no debt currently valued at $68 million. Accumulated cash reserves from rents and returns presently in excess of $6 million, and a property company holding real estate across the West Coast. He paused and looked for the first time directly at Dustin. "Including the land and the buildings beneath every hotel and restaurant in the Porter Hospitality portfolio." The silence in that room was total. I could hear the clock on the wall, the distant hum of the building, my own steady breath. Chelsea was the first to find words, and they came out cracked. "That can't be legal. He wasn't well. He was sick, he was under pressure. He didn't know what he was doing." Stanley Porter was examined by 3 independent physicians in the months before his death. Marcus said all of whom certified him of perfectly sound mind. Every signature on every page is his witnessed, notarized, and beyond challenge. I anticipated this objection. He anticipated it 15 years ago. Dustin was staring at the property documents as though they were written in a language that was dissolving in front of him. "The leases," he said slowly. "The rent, the outside property company we owe, the landlord that won't be charitable." He raised his eyes to me, and I watched the whole terrible shape of it arrive in him at once. "Mom, the landlord is you." "The trust holds the ground your hotels stand on," Marcus said quietly. "Beverly is its beneficiary. She has been in every way that matters your landlord since the day your father died. You have been signing the lease checks to your own mother, the woman you put on a bus to a one-room apartment, and you did not know it because Stanley built it so that you would only learn it here today, in this room, on this date." Voss set down his pen with the careful slowness of a man who understands he has been administering the smaller half of an estate all along. Chelsea had gone white beneath her careful makeup, her composure gone entirely, now her eyes darting between the documents and my face as if one of them might take it back, and Dustin simply lowered his head into his hands. For a moment no one spoke at all, and into that silence I felt something I had not expected. I had imagined this morning 1,000 times in the cold of that apartment, and in every version of it I had pictured triumph, a hot, bright flare of vindication. But sitting there watching my son's shoulders shake and my daughter-in-law's face come apart, I felt no triumph. I felt the strange, hollow quiet of a thing finally set right, and beneath it, an old ache for the family we might have been, if Stanley and I had raised them differently, if I had not taught them by my own endless yielding that some people are made to give and others to take. Chelsea turned to me at last, and her voice when it came was small and stripped of every bright camera-ready note I had ever heard in it. "Beverly, we didn't know, if we had known." "If you had known," I said, and my voice was quiet and even, "you would have been kind to me. You would have loved me because it was useful. I know that now, and so do you." No one answered because there was no answer. They had laughed at a key. They had inherited the chair and the debt and the famous name painted on the side. And I, the old woman they had discarded, sat across from them as the wealthiest person in the room, by a margin none of them had imagined holding in my own 2 hands the floor beneath their entire collapsing world. It was Dustin who spoke first, lifting his head from his hands, his eyes red. "Mom, the company is going under. The banks are calling everything in. We have weeks, maybe less. You could save it. With what Dad left you, you could pay off the debt and keep the whole thing standing, all of it, the hotels, the staff, the name." He did not say save us, but it hung in the air all the same. Chelsea leaned forward, and for one moment, the old hunger flickered back into her face, bright and desperate. "It would be nothing to you," she said, "a fraction of it, and it would keep the family whole." The family whole. I almost laughed at the phrase in her mouth on that morning. I looked at the 2 of them, my son and the woman he had married, and I waited until I was certain my voice would be steady, because what I said next I wanted them to remember for the rest of their lives. "No," I said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into a deep well. Chelsea flinched. Dustin closed his eyes. "I am not going to save the company." I said, and I want to be clear about why, because it is not the reason you think. It is not revenge. I am too old and too tired for revenge, and your father did not build me this wall so that I could spend the rest of my life punishing my own child. I am saying no because your father was right about the thing he was most afraid of. He gave you an empire, and he never taught you how to build one, only how to spend one. He gave you everything visible and nothing that lasts. If I write a check today, I will not be saving you. I will only be teaching you one final time that money appears whenever you have failed, that there is always someone to clean up behind you. And the next collapse will be larger, and there may be no one left to catch it. You are 40 years old, Dustin. It is very late for your first hard lesson, but it is not too late, and I love you too much to rob you of it the way I robbed you of every easy thing before it. Dustin was weeping openly now, not the performance of grief he had worn at the funeral, but the real thing, ugly and quiet. Chelsea stood up so abruptly, her chair scraped back. So that's it. You let your own son lose everything, after all the family did for you. All the family did for me, I repeated softly, and I let the silence answer her, because we both knew the shape of what the family had done for me, the apartment and the cut allowance and the unanswered calls, and there was nothing she could add to it that would survive being said aloud. She gathered her things and walked out her heels, striking the floor like small hammers, and she did not look back, and I understood that whatever Chelsea was, she was finished long before she reached the door. But Dustin stayed. He sat there in the emptying room, and when he finally looked up at me, his face was the face of the boy I used to rock through fevers stripped of the executive and the inheritor and the man who had put his mother on a bus. I'm sorry, he said. Not because I want anything. There's nothing left to want. I'm sorry because it was wrong, all of it, and I let her lead me into it, and I let myself be led because it was easy, and you had always made everything easy. I should have called you back. I should have come to that apartment myself. I knew where you were, Mom. I always knew, and I told myself I was too busy to look because looking would have meant feeling something. I crossed the room and I put my hand on my son's bowed head, the way I had not been allowed to in years, and I did not tell him it was all right, because it was not, and we were both too honest now to pretend otherwise. It came late, I said, but it came true, and that is more than I expected, and it is somewhere to begin. I did not save the company. Dustin filed for corporate bankruptcy within the month. The hotels were sold off one by one to a larger group, the famous name eventually painted over with someone else's, and the empire Stanley built from $200 borrowed dollars dissolved back into the city it had risen from. Chelsea left Dustin before the year was out, the way water leaves a vessel that no longer holds anything she wants. He did not fight it. The last I heard from Marcus, my son had taken a junior position with a hotel management firm 2 states away, an ordinary job with an ordinary salary, learning from the bottom, the business he had been handed from the top. And he wrote to me once a month, short letters, nothing asked for, only news. And at the end of each one, the same 3 words in handwriting that was beginning just slightly to resemble his father's. I wrote back every time. As for me, I did exactly what Stanley asked. I built the thing I had set aside. 3 months after that morning in the conference room, I stood in front of a small building on a quiet street near the water, a narrow 19th century property with good bones and a stubborn charm, and I watched a man fix a brass plate beside the door. 18 rooms. Not an empire. A boutique hotel, the kind I had dreamed of running before I learned to dream only of other people's dreams, small enough that I would know every guest by name and every creak and every stair. I had designed the interiors myself. I had hired the staff myself, 3 bright young people I paid well and taught everything I knew, the things I had carried fluent and unused for 45 years, how to read a room, how to calm a furious guest in 3 sentences, how to make a stranger feel for one night entirely at home. The brass plate caught the morning light. It read simply, "The Beverly." Not Porter. Mine. I keep Stanley's brass key on the desk in the small office behind the front desk, in a glass dish where I can see it every day. Sometimes a guest asks about it, and I tell them it opened a door I almost did not have the courage to walk through, and I leave it at that. I am 70 years old. I gave 45 of those years to becoming someone's shadow, and I do not regret all of it because I loved him, and love is never entirely wasted, even the kind that costs too much. But the woman who runs this hotel is not a shadow. She reads the balance sheet at a glance. She knows every name. And when she locks the front door at the end of a long, good day and climbs the stairs to the small, bright room she kept for herself at the top, she does not feel forgotten or reasonable or small. Stanley, my love you, broke my heart to give it back to me, and it was a terrible way to be loved, and it worked. Thank you for believing in the woman I was before I met you when I had forgotten her entirely. Thank you for the wall I could not give away and the door I finally opened, and the long, hard, unasked-for gift of having to find myself alone. It took me 70 years. It was worth every cold and hungry hour of it. Outside my window, the water catches the last of the light, and the city goes on full of doors, and for the first time in my life, every one of them is mine to open.